Hello and welcome to this Féile and Phobail event looking at the US presidential election titled The Numbers Game. I'm David McCann, the Deputy Editor of Slugger O'Toole, and we are going to be looking at some of the key races in this presidential election year in 2020. And to go through all of this, we have strategist Ian Russell bringing a wealth of experience in American politics to this. And Ian, we're delighted to have you here from across the pond, 3,000 miles away. Ian, I just wonder, could you just tell us just a short brief about yourself and how long you've been involved in American politics and what type of campaigns you've worked on?
Sure thing. So I've first of all, thanks for having me. It's great to join you remotely, and looking forward to being back in Belfast again as soon as that becomes a possibility. It's a wonderful city. I've been in American politics going on 18 years now, and over that time, I've seen some really incredible campaigns and worked for some really incredible people, some of whom won, some of whom did not. But I started working for a guy called Howard Dean, who was running against George Bush for president back in 2003. He was running very opposed to the Iraq War. That kind of got me into politics, and it's like I used to say it's like a disease, but now that we live in a pandemic, I will modify accordingly. But it's definitely a way of life, and once I took to it, I couldn't get out of it. And now I have no other marketable skills. But I worked my way up through the Democratic Party structure. I was the Deputy Executive Director and National Political Director for the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, which is the branch of the Democratic Party that works for Nancy Pelosi to elect Democratic members of the U.S. Congress. And so I did that for several years. Now I'm a media and digital consultant. So I make 30-second TV ads, I make digital ads, and I help advise candidates on strategy and their campaigns.
Fantastic. So you must be a very happy guy when election years come. Although this election is
I'm a very happy guy when election years are over.
But this election is very different. And one of the first questions that I wanted to come to you on is that campaigning in a pandemic. You're looking at the vice presidential debate was last week, and you saw Senator Kamala Harris with Vice President Mike Pence. And you saw the plastic screens in between the two of them. You saw the Trump Biden debate and the spacing, and normally there's big applauses when people when the candidates walk into the room, but the audience was so socially distanced that was kind of dim. So what's it been like for you? Because Americans are famous for their rallies. That's what we see on TV over here. We normally see thousands of people at rallies, and that has largely gone. So what's it like having a campaign in the middle of a pandemic?
There's no playbook for it, right? Everybody's making it up as they go along and attempting, at least on our side, on the Democratic side, to ensure that we don't turn events into super spreader episodes, that we aren't infecting people. We have this belief that it is bad politics to infect your own voters with a deadly disease, potentially deadly disease. Strangely enough, the Trump operation does not appear to be interested in those similar precautions. The president has already been talking about how quickly he can get back out on the rally circuit. He's held events both outdoors and indoors. There have been outbreaks of the disease and even, sadly, some deaths directly related to events that he's done. So there appears to be, in a shocking turn of events, no precautions, no responsibility from yet another thing that the Trump administration has failed at protecting the American people from. On our side, Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, and the Democratic Party has been really focused on making sure that we're putting people's health and safety first, but also not just sitting in a basement. We're getting out there, meeting with people, and in a responsible fashion, and campaigning, but campaigning in a very different way. You saw at the vice presidential debate, as you mentioned, the plexiglass shields. What an indictment, as Senator Harris is up there debating the guy who was the head of the Trump administration's coronavirus task force. We're months into a pandemic. The visuals just spoke for themselves. You had to have plexiglass dividers between the two of them because they failed so badly. It impacts the campaigns that I advise, the candidates that I advise, and how we do not only the presidential race, but also what we call down ballot, races for Congress, races for Senate, races for local office. I just got back from a television ad shoot. When we're on the set shooting campaign ads, if you think of political ads that you've seen in the past. You see a candidate talking to a couple senior citizens and a candidate talking to a couple of working people in a factory, maybe sparks flying behind them. Can't do a lot of those things because we can't turn our own events into super spreader events on our film shoots, our ad shoots either. So we go above and beyond to make it look like things are normal as possible. We found that voters are acutely aware that there's a pandemic going on and they don't need to see it all the time. You'll see some ads with candidates in masks. You'll see some ads with candidates. You'll always see Joe Biden in a mask in public. It's really important to set a good example. And I give the Biden campaign a lot of credit for just kind of figuring out how best to get him out there in a socially distant, responsible way, but still get him out into swing states to be able to do some campaigning. Just not the rope lines, the rallies, and the really crowded events that have become a hallmark of American politics.
So how because obviously, I mean, you've just pointed out there that the rallies have to be smaller, well, at least for some campaigns. Obviously, you can't have that physical connection. A candidate will struggle to get a physical rapport with voters. So does that make, I mean, you're just talking about you're just back from a TV ad there. Does that make TV ads and social media content all that more important this year?
It really does. Not surprisingly, people are watching a lot of television. They're spending a lot of time before in front of screens. And it's really important to tell a compelling story and meet voters where they are. It's a challenge, and we could really nerd out on this. And for the sake of your viewers, I won't take you into the weeds on how viewer habits are changing and how it's more important than ever that we have a broad way of getting ads in front of people, whether it's on Instagram or YouTube or on television. At the end of the day, we're telling a story, talking about our candidates and contrasting them with the other side and how they're literally, in some cases, dangerous for your health. But it has placed a real importance on making sure that we're delivering fresh, creative, and that requires doing shoots. You need new content, right? And it's a challenge when there are a lot of things that you can't do. And so we've had to really think outside the box about finding ways to present our candidates in a way that's safe, but a way that looks differently. It's on the presidential campaign, though, there's really no substitute for getting a candidate out there and getting them on your local news and getting them in your community or talking about issues that are important to voters in the swing states. Presidential campaigns, especially ones involving Donald Trump, are actually not as susceptible to paid communication because people have their opinion about Donald Trump. They're not going to change their mind about Donald Trump based on a 30-second TV ad that they happen to see after watching their favorite show some evening. They have their opinions already. His numbers have not moved in a meaningful fashion since he got elected in 2016. And so it's, however, been really important for Joe Biden to be out there with positive ads talking about why he's running, reintroducing himself to the country as someone who's going to put their healthcare first and really look out for them and really turn the page on this administration. So it's been interesting to contrast the needs, the imperatives of the two different campaigns. Trump likes to do these rallies. Biden needs to get up on TV and is on TV explaining to people why he's different and how he'd be a calming presence in the White House.
Now, I know it's always dangerous because I know you were saying you were worried about nerding it out there, but this is exactly what we're going to do for the next.
Anybody who's watching you and me talk is nerding it out with anyway.
So if you don't like polls and percentages, turn off now because we're about to go in it. Now, I know national polls don't count hugely in American politics because, of course, the Electoral College. I apologize for asking you such a straightforward question, but can you just briefly explain to us how the American president is elected? Because some people get perplexed over here. But Hillary Clinton won 3 million more votes than Donald Trump, or Al Gore won 500,000 more votes than George W. Bush, yet they didn't win. So can you just briefly explain that for us?
Yeah, and I mentioned at the outset that I really got involved in politics during the opposition to the war in Iraq. But what really got me into campaigns as a young person was watching the Supreme Court hand the presidency to George Bush when Al Gore got more votes in 2000. As you mentioned, Hillary Clinton famously or infamously won 3 million more votes than Donald Trump did, and yet Donald Trump becomes president. What happens in a democracy? Why doesn't the person who gets the most votes win? And it's because of a very old, antiquated system from the founding of this republic called the Electoral College, where states award electors. When you go to vote, when I've got my ballot, my vote by mail ballot sitting across the room here. When I go vote, I live in the District of Columbia, so I'm not even a state. But when Americans go vote, we vote for the person, but that vote is not counted directly for the individual. It goes to an elector, and the elector casts his or her vote for the prevailing candidate in their state. And of course, this was done for reasons of the fact that this was a federal republic and all these states, the original colonies, had their own delegations. And it's really a system that makes no sense and doesn't work anymore. And I think one of the fundamental challenges of America over the coming decades will be how we take a modern, diverse country of 300 plus million people, and we're growing out of some of these structures that were developed by slave-owning aristocrats 2+ centuries ago. We have the Electoral College, where you can win the election even if you get fewer votes, if you happen to get them in the right place. We have a U.S. Senate that is 100 members, 2 from each of the 50 states. In the coming years, by 2030, 30% of the population of the United States will have 70% of the Senate seats. People in California will live under the tyranny of people from Wyoming because they have the same number of Senate seats. And so we, as Americans, will have to really challenge. We're growing out of structures that have served the country reasonably well for a long time, but now we're seeing in this new deeply divided era their shortcomings. So that's a bit of a digression to say that the Electoral College is inherently unfair and strikes many people as such. It's why certain states demand a disproportionate amount of the candidate's attention. TV markets, media markets, cities that have television stations that go into swing states or are in swing states will get a lot of visits from candidates and a lot of ads from candidates. If you live in Phoenix, Arizona right now, Arizona is a relatively new addition to the list of swing states. I do some work for a congressman from Phoenix. We can barely get an ad on the air because everybody's getting swamped with ads from the presidential candidates. And there's a U.S. Senate race there too. So if you go just a little bit over to Utah, Utah is not a swing state. Donald Trump is going to win Utah. So the presidential campaigns are not advertising just one state over in the state of Utah because the results are a foregone conclusion. So it leads to a disproportionate prioritization of certain parts of the country at the expense of others. And just to even a grade school kid would seem inherently unfair. In a democracy, in a democratic republic, the person who gets the most votes ought to win the election. But we don't make the rules. We just have to learn to adapt to them. And as we're heading into November here, one of the worst case scenarios to contemplate is what happens if there's a very narrow election, there's a disputed election, and it goes back to the Supreme Court. Our institutions as a whole had a lot more legitimacy in 2000 when the Supreme Court stopped the recount in Florida and handed the election to George W. Bush. I don't think we'll be in this, and I hope to God we're not in a situation where there's a very close election here and it has to go to the courts. That would be very, very bad for the country.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's actually take a look at the election and see how it's going. Now, of course, I'm going to contradict myself here by looking at a national poll. Yep. The latest national CNN polls has Donald Trump trailing Joe Biden by 9 points, 53 to 42. Yep. But as many American political strategists point out, that the U.S. presidential election is really a whole bunch of governors' races, really, in effect. When we see the national polls, because that's typically what's flagged up here, what should we really just totally discount them, or is it trending, or does it actually point out a popular trend?
It definitely points out a trend. There's a lot of discussion about the accuracy of the polls after 2016. The polls at the end showed Secretary Clinton narrowly leading, and she, in fact, as you noted, got 3 million more votes. So it wasn't so much that the polls were off; it was that people had not interpreted. Data can be dangerous if you don't know how to interpret that data, and I think a lot of folks just couldn't believe that the country would elect Donald Trump. And again, he got extraordinarily lucky by narrowly winning in a few key states and using the Electoral College to propel himself to victory. But if you go back and look at those states now, states in the upper Midwest, what used to be called the blue wall, blue being for the Democrats, Wisconsin, Michigan, these are states that Democrats won for years, and Trump narrowly won. And that obviously changed the whole election. Trump is really lagging in those polls in those states right now. Some of the swing states, Pennsylvania is another one, Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, obviously the two major cities there. Trump is behind in all of the states that he would need to be to hit his 2016 numbers. And also in American politics right now, very similar to any other country, a region may move a little bit differently than another region, but people are generally consuming a lot of the same news, the same entertainment. We're culturally, a little bit more homogenous. And so you may see Wisconsin move a little bit differently than Minnesota, which is right next to it. But generally, you're not going to win one of those by 5 points and lose the other one by 5 points. Mm-hmm. It would be very strange for that to happen. People with a college degree or a post-college degree really soured on Donald Trump. That trend has only exacerbated since 2016. So we can go look at states and look at counties within those states that have large percentage of, we call them white-collar voters who have college or postgraduate degrees. Those are areas where Trump is really struggling. That's what's taking a state like Arizona or Georgia that have not been traditional state targets and putting them on the list this cycle because Trump is doing so poorly. So look at the national polling. If you really want to nerd out, look at the state-by-state polling. And always remember, the most accurate poll is the average of all the polls. Okay. So I always check the national polling average every day, and Biden is flirting with a 10% lead in the national polls, which by American standards is a landslide. I don't know if it will hold. We obviously don't know what will happen in the coming days and weeks. But we have to, as a political professional, I tell my clients this all the time, as a political professional, I have to give you insight, clear-eyed, cold-blooded analysis, whether the polls are good or the polls are bad. And the polls for Democrats happen to be very good right now. But again, so that can change.
So yeah, and we're gonna continue nerding it out here. So obviously the state that probably got you involved in politics, of course, 2000, it was the state everyone fought over. The networks declared it for Al Gore, called it back, declared it for Bush, then called it back.
Flashbacks here, you're killing me.
29 electoral votes. Donald Trump carried the state in 2016, which was a surprise. Most people thought Hillary Clinton would carry it. And the current poll of polls here have Biden with a lead of about 5 to 6 points. Yep. We're just under a month out. How confident? I mean, Barack Obama also carried Florida twice as well. And Bill Clinton won it twice too. So it can go Democratic. What do you think about Florida? Do you think that Biden's chances are good there?
Florida's a heartbreaker, as you noted. It's a heartbreaker, and it's a very complicated state because it has very different, diverse communities. Right, there's retired pensioners from the Midwest who voted Republican when they lived in Ohio, and then retired to Florida and vote Republican living in Florida. It's got a rapidly diversifying younger community of Puerto Ricans. There are the descendants of Cuban refugees that have fairly right-wing political views in Miami. And so you have sort of all this stuff put together. Small rural communities that behave very similar to Alabama and Georgia, which are right across the state line from northern Florida. So Florida is this big, it's not really a melting pot because in some cases these communities are not melding together, but it's a stew with these component parts. And so it will always, for the foreseeable future, it's always going to, in all likelihood, have very close elections. Interestingly, for this conversation, Florida was actually a bad state for Democrats in 2018. So Trump wins in 2016 narrowly, and if you go back and look at the states, as I mentioned, that he won in, we elected Democratic governors in Wisconsin, in Michigan, re-elected a Democratic governor in Pennsylvania. So the places that Trump made inroads into the blue wall, we bounced back in, elected new members of Congress, re-elected a U.S. senator from Michigan, and so forth. But if you look at Florida, we didn't really bounce back. We picked up a congressional seat or two, but we lost an incumbent U.S. senator, so elected statewide, and we lost a governor's race, a very competitive governor's race. So Florida's one of those places where you have a very high ceiling, a very high floor and a very low ceiling. It's always going to come down to just a few percentage points, not a lot of difference in between a winning campaign and a losing campaign. Compounding that is the fact that it's incredibly expensive to run a campaign there. You have the Miami media market in southern Florida, which is one of the most expensive in the country. And as I mentioned, because of the very diverse population, you also have to run ads in Spanish. You can't just run ads in English. And so you have to do a lot of campaigning. One of the reasons I'm watching Florida very closely this year is that obviously our hearts have been broken by it, but also, especially for those of you in Ireland, you can watch Florida results come in before you go to bed without having to stay up too late. Certainly not till you see dawn breaking in the morning, hopefully, because Florida, after the debacle of the 2000 elections, has become pretty adept at counting its ballots quickly. They actually learned some lessons and improved. And so, and they've pushed vote by mail. Both Democrats and Republicans have pushed vote by mail to try to get as much of their vote in before the election. So that if there aren't big problems, we could see results come out of Florida fairly quickly on election night. If Trump wins Florida, or if it looks like it's very close, the election could drag on for a very long time. But if Biden notches a win in Florida, it's very difficult to see how Trump can put the math together in the Electoral College to get reelected. But we won't know that until at least the wee hours of the morning your time.
Yeah, and of course, when Hillary Clinton was behind in Florida, that was the warning signs that this was not going to go well. When the central time states came in, and the blue wall states as well started to fall.
Even worse than that, I was working at the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee that cycle, and so I was monitoring House races coming in from dozens of districts across the country, where you see a snapshot of a constituency here or there. And as you know, and as we discussed, you can see how different demographic groups are moving. And when we saw the first results to come in, even from non-competitive states, but constituencies that we were hoping would be competitive, and we saw this big swing, especially in rural and working class districts against Clinton for Trump, we knew that was going to be a problem later in the night when we started seeing results from places like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. And of course, it turned out to be far worse than we projected.
Yeah. Now, another classic swing state, the state of Ohio, typically goes with the winner, has gone with the winner in every presidential election for the past 40 years. No Republican has ever won the presidency without winning the state of Ohio. 18 electoral votes. This is normally a really close state. You remember Karl Rove in 2010 had a breakdown on Fox News when they declared it for Barack Obama, and Megyn Kelly had to walk back to the decision desk over it. Put George W. Bush over the line in 2004. Current polls show it is neck and neck, 47-47 each. Why is Ohio? I mean, Ohio, the state that typically is 1 or 2 points in it, Trump actually won it by a pretty decent margin. They've had Republican governors there that have repudiated Trump.
Yep.
What's going on? Why is he so popular there?
It's an interesting state. It's lagged behind. This goes back to our conversation about the Electoral College and national polls versus state polls. While regions tend to move together, there is some difference. I mentioned Wisconsin and Minnesota, but a really good example is Michigan, where I'm from, and Ohio. Michigan is Democrats tend to do a few percentage points better than Ohio, even though Ohio is right next door. The suburbs, the educated suburbs around big cities in Ohio have tended to lag other suburbs in other parts of the country for a variety of reasons. It just appears to be a few points more GOP, more conservative than similar communities elsewhere in the country. And so that means, as you indicated, it's a must-win for Trump because no Republican's been elected president without winning Ohio. Biden's math does not require him to win Ohio. If Ohio's another one to watch on election night, because if Biden wins Ohio, it really is over for Trump. As you noted, there's a Republican governor there. He was elected in 2018. So another state where, while places were bouncing back from how badly Democrats did from 2016, bouncing back in 2018, Ohio was not one of those places. We did have a Democratic Senator, Sherrod Brown, get reelected there in the last few years. But it is generally it's a tougher place. But it will be interesting to see. It has some auto manufacturing. It has a lot of other factories, blue collar labor. These were people who liked Trump for a number of reasons in 2016, and probably voted Democratic for a long time, probably some trade union members. They're now faced with a question. We got Trump because we wanted a disruptor, but has the disruption made our lives any better? And so Ohio is definitely an interesting state to watch. I would still give Trump maybe a narrow edge, but I would not go bet a large sum of money on him winning it.
Okay, and another state you were mentioning there where Democrats have bounced back, Wisconsin was a big, obviously Hillary Clinton was really heavily criticized for not even really contesting the state because she didn't think she'd need to. When that went, it was a big deal. Wisconsin has gone Democratic in every presidential election since 1992. But you mentioned about bouncing back. Scott Walker, who was the darling of the right of the Republican Party, very long-term governor, was defeated there in 2018. And the polls are showing in Wisconsin Biden with a 5-point lead on average. Yep. How confident would you be of the Democrats taking those 10 electoral votes back?
I feel pretty good about Wisconsin for all the reasons you mentioned. The party has been rebuilt there. While Secretary Clinton was really criticized for not campaigning there, it's really become the butt of a joke, especially when our national convention, which was supposed to be in Milwaukee to demonstrate the largest city in Wisconsin, to demonstrate our commitment to Wisconsin. And of course, the pandemic happened. So a lot of jokes were made about how, well, Democrats still aren't even coming to Wisconsin. In truth, Clinton's challenges were deeper than that. She knew she had a problem in Pennsylvania. She campaigned there a lot. She still lost Pennsylvania. So I cut her some slack. I don't know that an in-person campaigning might have made a noticeable difference, but when you lose by the narrow margin she did, everything played a role, no doubt. So I feel cautiously optimistic about Wisconsin. I've been talking to friends of mine that are political operatives in Wisconsin on the ground out there, and they're saying that it's moving in our direction. Where our numbers are looking good in the right places. You know, Wisconsin has a very big city, Milwaukee, which has a very large African American population. Then it has these educated suburbs we talked about. And there's also some other parts of the state that Democrats can really run up the score and make up for losses elsewhere. So it's one of these places where Trump has struggled to deliver for the people that voted for him in 2016, aside from the core hard conservative base who just like going to the rallies. You know, we call them the Kool-Aid drinking MAGA crowd, the Make America Great Again crowd. Beyond that, 40% of the electorate, which is, for me as an American, still a depressingly high percentage of the electorate. He just has not found a way to go get undecided voters or voters who gave him a chance in 2016 back on sides. And that becomes a real problem for him in a very narrow state like Wisconsin.
Okay, and another state that I want to go to, Pennsylvania, which was always reliably Democratic. So many Republicans threw a lot of Pennsylvania. John McCain did, George W. Bush did, Mitt Romney did, and they always came up short. The Democratic candidates, even when they lost, were always able to win in Pennsylvania. Joe Biden's state is where he's from, even though he doesn't represent it. He's got a comfortable lead there of about 10 to 12 points, 20 electoral votes. You got to be feeling pretty good about Pennsylvania.
It's a big prize. Pennsylvania is a state I know very well. My maternal great grandparents immigrated from Ireland. The Brophies settled in Philadelphia. It's one of the many an immigrant story that has made Pennsylvania quite a diverse and interesting state. We've got a great Congressman Brendan Boyle, who's been very active on issues related to Ireland in the north and Brexit, and represents part of Philadelphia. Only member of the Congress, by the way, with a parent born in Ireland. His father's from Donegal. So there's your trivia for those that have stayed in the conversation this long. But Brendan's been telling me he's feeling good about how things are going. You got to turn out the vote in that community, but also reach out to cut Trump's margins in rural areas. James Carville, who helped elect Bill Clinton back in 1992, famously said that Pennsylvania was Pittsburgh and Philadelphia with Alabama in the middle. And for those who know American political geography, that means you got two Democratic cities and then you've got a very, very conservative area in the middle. And if Biden can make sure that he turns out the vote in Philadelphia and in Pittsburgh and in their suburbs, I keep mentioning the suburbs, it's the story of the last few years in American politics of how these suburbs have turned. I feel pretty good about it. You mentioned that Joe Biden is from Pennsylvania. He grew up in Scranton. He still has kind of that working class, aw shucks, everyman credential. that he developed there, growing up in Scranton. His wife Jill is from Philly, and you hear her speak, and I can just close my eyes and hear members of my family from Philadelphia with this heavy Philadelphia accent. If Joe Biden can't win Pennsylvania, I don't know what Democrat could, but I feel really good about how the campaign's going there. I mentioned that we reelected a Democratic governor there in 2018, as well as picked up some congressional seats. So it will be competitive, but Joe Biden's not going to let off the gas pedal when it comes to Pennsylvania.
Yeah, and I want to go out west, because this is so just for the nerds who are hoping to stay up an election. A lot of these states are in Central Time, so sadly you have to stay up a bit longer to see them. They aren't on the East Coast time zone, so you have to stay up for another hour to see some results come in. But we're going to go out west now. I want to go to Arizona. Now, Arizona has been a Republican state. It has produced two GOP nominees, Barry Goldwater and John McCain, famously. But of course, John McCain, the great critic of Donald Trump right up until his death, and then Cindy McCain, his wife, has backed Joe Biden. Now, the polls are showing it's neck and neck between Biden and Trump. Biden in the last polls at 48, Trump at 49. That's a statistical tie, 11 electoral votes. Could Biden possibly flip Arizona?
I think he could. I've been talking to some of the Biden people out there. They're feeling cautiously optimistic. This has been a heartbreaker before. Well, it's been a state that wasn't even on the list before. Then we saw some tantalizing numbers in a few previous election cycles, but it broke our hearts every time. However, in 2018, we elected a Democratic senator from there, and have built on competitive congressional races. I mentioned I've got a client who's a congressman from outside of Phoenix. The numbers in Arizona are demonstrating how, again, these suburban communities, younger communities, and more diverse communities, that's who's moving to Arizona right now. People are moving to Arizona from California for jobs and for cheaper housing, but they're continuing to vote like they live in California, which is a lot more of a progressive state. Also, issues of healthcare access and affordable healthcare are really important to working people and to senior citizens. California has long been a big retirement destination for the weather. And so I'm really keeping an eye on Arizona, but I would urge anybody watching, don't stay up waiting for the results. Not only, as you mentioned, is it in a Western time zone, so you have to tack on a few extra hours from the East Coast, but Arizona for years has gotten people enrolled in a permanent absentee vote program. So Arizonans of both parties, and I keep saying, I mentioned this in Florida too, I keep saying both parties because one of the big stories of this election cycle has been how Donald Trump has politicized the act of voting by mail, which is bizarre to me as a political strategist. I want my voters voting however the hell they want to, as long as they're voting for my people. Let's get those votes in. We'll get them in through the mail. We'll take you to the polls on election day. Doesn't matter. Just get your vote in. But Trump has really declared war on vote by mail for some reason. It'll be interesting to see that in Arizona because for years, both parties in Arizona ran very effective vote by mail campaigns, and the state government really embraced this. So it means that it can take a long time for results to come in. Something that we could see in Arizona, but also in other parts of the country, is because of this polarization and more of Trump's voters voting on election day and Democrats voting early, typically the election day vote is counted first in a lot of places. And so you could see Trump do better on election night and then lose ground as the votes are counted after the election, and Biden could surpass it. This has happened in Arizona for years. Nobody in Arizona gets freaked out about it because it's happened for years. But it could be, I was involved in a recount for a congressional race in Arizona back in 2014. I think it took 3 weeks before the election. It was a very close race. We only lost by a few dozen votes and out of hundreds of thousands cast. And it took until the end of November to get the winner. So if it's a close race and if Arizona really is in play, which it unquestionably is at this stage, buckle up because it could be a couple of weeks until we know the winner in Arizona. And in all likelihood, around the country, remember that Biden is likely to improve on his performance as votes that came in before Election Day are counted.
Mhm. Okay, and another swing state that I want to go to, and this is one that has flipped really from being a traditional kind of red state. It was never hardcore red, but it was traditional for the Republicans. Virginia. Now, of
Mhm.
all the loads of swing states went wrong for
Not
Hillary
even a
Clinton,
swing
but
state
this
anymore.
stuck with her. Virginia stuck with her. Maybe it was because her running mate Tim Kaine was from there, but Virginia stuck with her. It was one of the few states that held for her, 13 electoral votes, and Biden has a lead at the minute, poll of polls, of 12 points. Now, this was a state that George W. Bush carried twice, was
Yep.
typically reliably red. What has happened in Virginia? Why has it flipped so decisively?
I've been in politics long enough to remember what a big deal it was when we elected a Democratic governor in Virginia in 2005. And now it's not even really a swing state, as you mentioned, as you gave the poll numbers. Virginia has rapidly diversified. The area right across the river from me, I live in Washington on Capitol Hill, and right across the river from me in Northern Virginia, that area has exploded. A lot of high-tech jobs, government-related jobs. Again, the story of the suburbs. These folks have never been supporters of Trump. And Trump will lose Virginia, and he'll lose Virginia by a fairly large margin. That's changed the electoral center of gravity in the state away from rural and more conservative communities. Northern Virginia has really led, but also Richmond, the state capital, has grown and become more Democratic, and other places have become less Republican. There's an area around a major naval installation in Norfolk, Virginia, that elected a Democratic member of Congress in 2018. So even the more conservative areas have become less conservative, while the Democratic areas have become incredibly Democratic. So it's happened at warp speed by electoral standards. 15 years ago, we were barely talking about Virginia as an opportunity. It was a big deal when Obama won it in 2008. An African-American guy wins the capital of the old Confederacy during the Civil War. For a lot of us, was a really meaningful symbol. And now we just expect that the Democrat's going to win it. Tim Kaine probably helped being on the ticket, but it was going to be Clinton State anyway. And 4 years from now, we won't even mention it. Just like I assume we're not going to talk about Connecticut or Rhode Island or Illinois, states that are firmly in one column.
Well, the other thing, I mean, I want to go before we go on and talk about the broader election. Do you think that there is any state that could surprise? So I remember when Barack Obama in 2008 carried North Carolina, it was such a big deal. And when Trump, for example, won Michigan, it was Democrats. Even I remember, I think a political pundit said even Michael Dukakis won Michigan in 1988 when he got trounced by George H.W. Bush. What state do you think there'll be any potential state that we will look at this time and go, I didn't think that would go that way?
Well, asking to predict a surprise is by its very definition a complicated and risky thing to do, especially in an era where we have a lot more data. One of the things that I'm really interested in, though, is some of these states that are conservative, have some elements of conservative culture, as your viewers probably know. Gun ownership, for example, in rural communities is a real big thing in America. Places that are more conservative and rural, but not right-wing Christian. So we have a region of the country in the South called the Bible Belt, which heavily dominated by very kind of right-wing conservative Christian interests. But there's other parts of the country, and so they tend to be anti-abortion and anti-gay marriage, as well as the kind of conservative trappings of any right-wing campaign, low taxes, low government spending, bad social services, things like that. What I'm interested in this cycle is places that have some conservative culture, but are more libertarian, more small government. Marry who you want to marry. If you want to smoke a joint, that's your business. If you want to own a gun, that's your business, but aren't as influenced by right-wing religious views. So I do a lot of work in Maine, which is in the far northeast, closest part of the United States to Ireland, full of Irish towns with names like Bangor and Belfast. I was just up there shooting an ad a couple of weeks ago for a congressman who flipped a district in 2018 that Trump won by 10 points and now has bounced back to Democrats. But I'm interested in how places like Northern Maine will go. Montana in the Mountain West is an example of this, and even Alaska at the far other side of the continent. Places that Democrats have come up short in for years, They don't like being dictated to by big government, but they also don't like being dictated to by people that they consider to be, social and religious fanatics with medieval social worldviews. So if there's a place where Biden might, I'm not saying it's going to happen. I want to be clear. I'm not making predictions here, but if Biden wins the traditional swing states, puts a few of the new swing states like Arizona, which we discussed, or Georgia, which is probably lagging a couple of cycles behind Arizona in terms of how it's becoming a swing state. And if the bottom really falls out for Trump, you could see some of these other places go. There's a very competitive, what appears to be a very competitive U.S. Senate race in Alaska. And it could be interesting to see. Again, I don't think it's going to happen, but I'll be interested in seeing how well Biden does in Alaska, Montana, northern Maine. Again, these kind of rugged, individualistic, libertarian parts of the country that just don't like the kind of, we call it the Bible thumping that some people around Trump do.
And obviously, we were talking a wee bit earlier about demographics being a real issue, because turnout is such a big thing in presidential elections. America, I've in doing prep for this, I was shocked to learn, has actually one of the lowest turnouts of any modern democracy. More than 4 out of every 10 Americans don't vote in presidential elections. I just want to break down some demographics here. Obviously, what are called minority voters. So we're looking at people like Latinos, like African Americans. Obviously, they can decide some key states like Arizona, Texas, Florida. So taking the Latino vote, they represented 11% of all voters in the 2016 election. They're the fastest growing voting bloc in the United States. What impact do you think that they will have? Because Trump actually marginally improved, despite his comments, marginally improved on Mitt Romney's performance with the Latino community. Do you think Biden and Kamala Harris have a better chance there?
I do. It's really important that as Democrats, we not take anybody for granted who's part of certainly not anybody who's part of our electoral coalition. And not surprisingly, when Obama was running in 2008 and in 2012, he scored much higher turnout levels and a larger share of the vote among African Americans and young people and other groups that Democrats need to win. Clinton had a bit of a drop off in her support, and of course that's the ball game. It's really important and that Biden not take anybody for granted, and he's working really hard to make sure that he runs up the score in those communities. Texas is a good example of this. You mentioned Texas briefly. One of the things that would be just earth-shattering in American politics is if a Democratic presidential candidate were to flip a state like Texas. Texas is, of course, the cowboy state. It's George W. Bush's home state. For us as Democrats for years, it was a sign of all that was wrong with American politics during the Bush administration. But now Texas has really changed. As I keep mentioning the suburbs of big cities in Texas like Houston and San Antonio and Dallas, Fort Worth. These are enormous cities with rapidly diversifying suburbs and working class populations. And there always have been a large minority community there, especially the Latino community. Biden has to do very, very well and has to spend a lot of time getting out the vote. We talked at the beginning of the conversation about how to campaign in a pandemic, and one of the challenges that we have is the traditional, we call them GOTV, get out the vote operations are somewhat hobbled. We can't do the types of rallies, but also we have events in African American communities called Souls to the Polls, where you get your people after church and get them in buses and get them off to go vote early if you can in that community, or get them to fill out their absentee ballots. Can't do some things like that these days. And so we're having to find new ways of really make sure that our voters get out and vote. We kind of joke, but it's actually true that the co-chair of our Get Out the Vote campaign is really Donald Trump, because every time he says it does something, every time he tweets, it gets our voters even more angry and focused. Trump has tried to make a few inroads. He's going to come nowhere near winning the African American or the Hispanic vote, but he's tried to do some things to just cut Biden's margins a little bit among especially African American men. Biden will still win African American men. Trump's trying to just move the numbers a little bit. We talked about Florida, the Hispanic vote. No demographic is monolithic. The Latino community is especially diverse. I mentioned Cubans, which tend to vote very differently than Puerto Ricans, who vote very differently than Hispanics that have been in the country since the country existed in places like Texas and New Mexico. So understanding, respecting, and working around those differences is really important. In a place like Texas, Latino turnout will help tell us the result. In a place like Florida, it will not, because it will matter which kind of Latinos turned out. If you see huge turnout out of Miami, but it's the right-wing Cubans, you're going to have a very different result than if younger Cubans or Puerto Ricans turn out. And so that's one of the many things that really makes America great is our diversity, and we're going to see that in putting new states like Texas in play. And you're seeing a lot of time, a lot of money, and a lot of effort at turning out minority communities, celebrities, basketball players, other sports figures. LeBron James, one of the greatest basketball players in world history, is running an organization to get people to vote. You're seeing a lot more ostensibly non-political, non-partisan efforts. Those are efforts that are going to help those that want to beat Trump, because we're turning out constituencies, audiences that are likely to overwhelmingly support Biden if they get to the polls.
Yeah, and of course, African-American voters in the primary battles helped deliver Joe Biden the nomination.
Joe Biden's always had a lot of credibility in the African-American community since Barack Obama trusted him to be his vice president. And yeah, you're right. Biden is our nominee to a large degree because middle-aged and older African-Americans in South Carolina, which is a key state in the primary calendar, rode in behind Biden and thought that he was the best bet to beat Trump. And here we are.
Yeah. I want to ask you, well, I've got two final questions for you. Obviously, just because we've just had the vice presidential debate now, a lot of American political strategists will say, look, people vote top of the ticket. Your VP picks aren't may not be as decisive. But what do you think about, obviously, Biden has picked Senator Kamala Harris from California, which is a safe Democratic state, and obviously, despite some speculation he might be dropped, Vice President Pence is back up again. Do you think the two? Do you think the two of them will have any impact on the final result?
Only if they really screw up. I mean, that's the story of the vice presidential pick in modern politics. You want somebody who doesn't cause any problems, who kind of rounds out an area you might not be as adept in as the nominee. When I was really excited when then Senator Obama picked then Senator Biden as his running mate. I was a big Obama supporter. I had supported and worked for Obama in the primaries against Hillary Clinton back in 2007 and 2008. But Obama was young, relatively new to the scene, going up against John McCain, who was an institution in American politics, and picking an affable, at the time we thought, old, Irish guy from Pennsylvania was probably a good pick. Here we are 15 years later, and Biden doesn't look a day older, right? And is our nominee. But Harris brings new energy. I thought she did a great job the other night in the debate. She's a good campaigner herself. She's going to excite constituencies like African Americans. She's also Asian American. Her mother is from the subcontinent, and that's also exciting a community as well that we need to really get out to vote in large numbers. So that's really exciting. Pence gave Trump a lot of credibility with evangelical Christian conservatives that were suspicious of this trash-talking developer from New York who was their nominee. And so you want somebody that can help, but at the end of the day, nobody who's really wavering between Trump and Biden is going to be swayed by a vice presidential pick in all likelihood.
Yep. And final topic, and we have to ask about this for the audience: Irish America. Now, I have seen surveys that show Irish Americans are pretty evenly split between those who back the Democratic Party and those who back Republicans. Mitt Romney, for example, Irish Central did a poll, found that 48% of Irish America were supportive of Mitt Romney, 51% for then President Obama. Now, will Irish Americans play a role in places like Pennsylvania? I know there are other Irish American states would be New York and Massachusetts, which are solid for the Democrats. But do you think that Irish Americans could potentially have an impact in some states like Pennsylvania?
They will. I mean, the Irish American immigrant story, I mentioned my own family is Irish immigrants. The Irish immigrant story is the story of America, one of the many stories of America. That's what's great about this country. And Biden, I think, is uniquely positioned to capitalize on that because he is of that community. I think that we've already seen great outreach from the Biden campaign to the Irish American community. Just last week, I participated in a online Zoom event that the Biden campaign held geared at Irish Americans to talk policy. Samantha Power, of course, who was in the Obama-Biden administration, spoke, as well as some other prominent Irish Americans in the Democratic Party, and talked about issues of concern to the Irish American community, including Brexit. It was really good to see, not a surprise, but really good to see Biden come out strongly and talk about how if there's a hard border as a fallout of Brexit, there will be no trade deal under his watch with the UK. That was very good to see. We've got Irish American leaders in the Congress who have not only Joe Biden's ear, they have Nancy Pelosi's ear. The Irish American community has great champions of people like Richie Neal from Massachusetts. I mentioned Brendan Boyle from Philadelphia, and many, Dan Kildee from Michigan. Many have too many to name. I don't want to leave anybody out, but that's the Irish Americans. I think, as everybody watching this probably knows, we've really outpunched our weight over the years because of some great leadership and really adept politicians. You're going to see it first and foremost in this bright line that Joe Biden and Nancy Pelosi both laid down about if there's a hard border, Boris Johnson's not going to get a trade deal. It's something that I think the British government actually didn't really understand, that under one of the many things about the American system that's unique in most parliamentary systems, if you want a trade deal, if the prime minister wants a trade deal, he's going to get a trade deal. But over here, if the president wants a trade deal, it's got to go through the House of Representatives. And in the House of Representatives, it's got to go through what's called the Ways and Means Committee, one of the most important committees in American government. That committee is controlled by prominent Irish American Richie Neal. So I pity the poor British government bureaucrat who first realized, oh my goodness, we have a problem here. We got to get something through Richie Neal's committee, and that's not going to happen if there's a hard border. So Biden's been very good about doing that policy level outreach, but he also, the way he tells stories, the way he talks about growing up in Scranton, watching his dad lose his job, how that shaped his worldview, being on the side of those who don't have a lot in material wealth, but have a lot in sort of cultural and emotional importance. These are stories that Irish American households are going to recognize as their own stories. Now, we also have some cousins in the Irish American community who went hard conservative, and we don't need to diagnose their psychosis in this conversation. But you're going to see some if you look at a who's who in the Trump administration. For me, as an Irish American, there's an embarrassing number of prominent Irish last names on the list of Trump campaign staffers. So the Irish American community is certainly not a monolithic one by any means, but I think you'll see Biden do better there than other nominees potentially would have.
Yeah, I know many people in my own family who have gone over to America have see some virtues in President Trump as well. Ian, thank you so much for such a fascinating conversation. This was an hour.
Great crack. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and this was an hour talking about numbers and swing states. I can't wait for the election, and the hardcore of us will no doubt be staying up till about 4 or 5 in the morning. Hopefully, we get a winner by 3 a.m. at least Irish time, and hopefully by 11 p.m. your time, we can get a winner.
Here's hoping, but I'd brew some strong coffee and settle in.
If the result goes the wrong way, you might need something a bit stronger. Yeah. Ian, thank you so much.
Hey, thank you.